for the electron transport chain. This is lesson 7D. So we're going to talk a little bit about this next step with the electron transport chain. So the electron transport chain is that last and final step in cellular respiration. So where we went so far is we took glucose, right? We took glucose. We took glucose and we broke it all the way down to CO2. So we broke it down. So we took one glucose molecule and we broke it into 6 molecules of carbon dioxide. And the other thing that we generated was a whole bunch of this NADH and this other molecule called FADH. So we generated NADH and FADH by taking glucose and breaking it down to carbon dioxide. So that's what we've done. That's what we did in the last 2 steps. In glycolysis, we took glucose and we split it in half. In the Krebs cycle, we took that acetyl-CoA and ripped it into carbon dioxide to make this NADH and FADH. And in this step, we're going to talk about what happens to the NADH and the FADH. What happens? Where does it go? Why do we get rid of it? What ends up with it? So this is our last step of cellular respiration. This step needs oxygen, so it requires oxygen. This step is aerobic. It requires oxygen, needs oxygen. Without it, it can't function. And it takes place on the membrane of the inner membrane in the mitochondria, that area called the cristae, all those folds. And this makes sense. So the reason why the cristae have all these folds is because it gives us more surface area to volume. And more surface area allows us to do more of the electron transport chain to generate more energy in the mitochondria quicker. So more surface area on the membrane allows us to do more. So that's where it takes place, on those folds in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. It's going to use ATP synthase. If we remember back from photosynthesis, it's going to use that protein called ATP synthase. And remember, we talked about ATP synthase as being that water wheel. As hydrogens rush through ATP synthase, right, it turns a wheel. So it's kind of like one of those old-fashioned water wheels. So as hydrogen rushes through this water wheel, not a great drawing, yikes. Okay, so as hydrogen rushes through, it's going to spin that water wheel, generating ATP. So if you remember that one. We're going to do that same process. So it's going to use ATP synthase, and it's going to look a lot like the light reaction of photosynthesis, except we don't need to use light. We've already generated these high-energy electron carrier molecules. So in this case, we're going to take that NADH and FADH, and we're going to drop off the hydrogens and the electrons, and we're going to use those hydrogens and those electrons to make energy. So it uses the electron transport chain to set up a hydrogen gradient. Okay? So think back to cellular transport. That hydrogen gradient is the idea that if we have a membrane, if I have a membrane here, and I have a whole bunch of little hydrogen ions over here, a whole bunch of hydrogen ions, those hydrogen ions are going to want to rush through to this side because there's more on the top than there is on the bottom through diffusion. So because of that, we're going to set up the hydrogen gradient again, and then we're going to force those hydrogen ions to rush through ATP synthase, and that's going to generate our ATP energy for us. Here is the whole process, and I know this is a big complicated drawing and I know it's confusing, but let's just try to make sense of it as it stands. So let's start over here. So this is kind of a weird place for this diagram to start, but it starts right over here. Here's number 1. First thing that happens is NADH drops off hydrogens and electrons. So it drops off, here's hydrogens, and here's electrons. Okay, I know it's kind of hidden up there, that 2E. So now the NADH has dropped off its hydrogen and its electron. That electron does the same thing it does as in the light reaction of photosynthesis, where it gets passed through an electron transport chain. There's that electron transport chain. As it gets passed through that electron transport chain, the same thing happens in the light reaction. We pump hydrogens into the intermembrane space, the space between the outer and inner membrane. So we fill up the inner membrane space with hydrogens. That's the whole purpose. So when we drop those hydrogens off here, so we dropped them off on the outside. We dropped them off on the outside, remember over here, and we pump them through this, and then we pump them through into the inner membrane space. Okay? FADH2 does the same thing. It drops off some hydrogens here and electrons, and then those electrons get moved through this electron transport chain, and that pumps hydrogens into this outer membrane or the inner membrane space, and that generates that gradient. We pump a whole bunch of hydrogens into the inner membrane space. So it happens with NADH and FADH. They do the same thing. Drop off their hydrogens and electrons, pass them along an electron transport chain to pump hydrogens through these proteins. Then the last and final step, so that would be 1. This pumping of the electron transport chain would be 2. The pumping of hydrogens is 3. And the last and final thing that happens is this, 4. Those hydrogens come rushing through ATP synthase, they turn the water wheel, and they generate ATP from ADP. That's the whole cycle. That's it. A couple FADHs and NADHs drop off their hydrogens, and they do this. Now, the last thing that happens, the one last piece, and that's it, I promise. The one last piece is this. What happens with those hydrogens is this. They meet up with oxygen over here to generate water. So the hydrogens, after they've lost their electrons, they grab the electrons that have just been passed through that electron transport chain. They meet up with hydrogens and oxygens, and they form water. So water's a waste. So water gets out as a waste product. It's a waste product. But that also means that this thing requires oxygen. So we need oxygen to run the product, which means oxygen has to come in to the electron transport chain. That's the whole thing. That's the electron transport chain. We have one little piece of information to talk about, and that's fermentation. But other than that, that's it. We're there. We've taken glucose, we've broken it into carbon dioxide to make a whole bunch of NADHs and FADHs, and then we use those NADHs and FADHs to make tons of ATP. That's it. That's how your cells make energy. That's how you live. Exciting. All right, well, if you have any questions about this class, feel free to ask me anytime. I'm here to help you out. So that's that. Have a good day, class.